Hello and welcome to this regulatory domain session as part of the buildingSMART International Standards Summit, Valencia 2024. Thank you for joining. My name is Sheila Karai-Lum and I will be your moderator today. Today's session is titled Introduction and Updates. The speaker for this session is Nicholas Nisbet, who is Director at AEC3 Limited and Vice Chair of the buildingSMART in UK and Ireland chapter. The session is scheduled to last for 90 minutes. Which will also include some time for some questions at the end. This session is being recorded and will be made available in the replay section of the event as soon as possible. Before I hand over to the speaker, I would like to remind you that this is a hybrid event. For those of you joining us online, your microphones will remain muted. However, if you wish to make any comments or questions, please just use the chat box in the control panel. For the attendees here in the room, please try your best to keep the background noise to a minimum. And if you wish to make a comment or ask any questions, please just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. And on that note, I would like to also bring your attention that buildingSMART is committed to ensuring that participation in the development of standards is unrestricted and the process for their adoption is transparent. And standards that are developed do not favour any particular provider and are open, non-binding and accessible to all. Please take note of our antitrust code of conduct, which is up on the screen. And on that note, I'll hand over to you, Nick.
Thank you for coming. I apologise for doing the introduction and update session third rather than first, but both Franco and Tommy had commitments. So this is a chance to think about the regulatory domain and how we're taking it forward. And I really hope to hear from you about what you think of what we're doing and what else we might address. So I hope it'll be a bit of a workshop. Okay. I'm going to do a quick summary of the two other sessions which covered guidance for regulators and the regulatory information requirements. Very happy to talk about those further. I also want to bring you up to date with the two other sessions, the sustainability information requirements and the exercise that we completed just before lunch, the building domain demonstration, which included some regulatory checks. And then it's really an opportunity to think what, assuming we complete the projects we've got going, what else should we be looking at? Okay. I think one of the nice things about the regulatory domain is that we've benefited from some really good work over 10 or 12 years now. And so we have this vision that the regulations and also requirements, client requirements and so on, should become involved in the buildingSMART processes and that increasingly we should be thinking about automated regulatory processes. And I think we're now seeing examples around the world where this is starting to happen. We also have this idea that it might be a gradual process and that from the current activity, we might go through, or some countries might go through a process of accepting 3D models alongside PDF drawings, and then they would start to use those models for some checking and maybe for measuring and reviewing. And then that would lead to a time when automated code compliance would be possible and we could start to see getting regulatory results very quickly. And as that becomes more possible, I think we'll also see client requirements also being checked. So currently we have a very active committee and steering committee. And we're always glad if people wish to become involved. As I say, Franco Coyne and Tommy Hentonen have been very active in the last year and a half, 2 years in supporting our current projects. But actually everyone in the group makes a really good contribution. And what we done is in large part due to the really good steering committee and Sheila's support. The job of the regulatory domain is to take the expectations, the needs of our community, and where necessary to turn them into projects that can improve the use of building smart standards in our area, and try and disseminate those outwards. And so very often the projects will deliver additions to the Building Smart Data Dictionary, or now we can produce IDS files to communicate what we think is important and should be in the IFC models being shared. I think the other thing that we produce is reports, and it's very gratifying to find that the reports that we've produced, starting with the work that Masaki and Muto did 10 years ago, technical reports that we did 5 years ago, are still being cited and used around the world to back up discussions about regulatory processes. So we're trying to be relevant and stay relevant. The earlier session, the first session, looked at the guidance for regulators. We started with the outcome that we discovered through a survey process that on the whole, regulators don't know what OpenBIM can do, and that they don't often come to Building Smart conferences. And so we thought that it was really important to try and reach out to them. And so we've prepared the guidance for regulatory document, and we've gathered material from lots of countries, lots of contributing authors, and we're now in the process of taking the final draft and reviewing it. And anyone, and this applies to everything I'm saying today, if you want more information or if you'd like to help with reviewing the document, then please do get in touch. I probably ought to check if there are any regulators in the room, because occasionally they come, and we should make them welcome. I think the outreach that we do, so we did a big survey which we translated into several languages, and we got the information about people's priorities and perceptions. And then we responded by saying we really need to produce this guidance for regulators, or to give it its full title, Guidance for Regulators About OpenBIM. Yes, so as soon as it's finalized in the next few months, we will try and get it into as many places as possible. In the session yesterday, we talked about the possibility that some chapters may want to translate it and add local content to it and so on. And I think that's a very important opportunity. One of the things we learned from the survey was that whilst English is the language of Building Smart International, we should take every opportunity to translate, to speak different languages. Frankly, I have to rely on the people around me for that, because I only speak 2 languages, English and IFC. So we're ready to go with that document and start to get the review process completed. It'll then have to go to the Standards Committee of Building Smart, to get it endorsed. So a few more weeks yet, but it's really good to see it coming to fruition. The other project we reported on yesterday was the regulatory information requirements. And that really was trying to harvest from the various regulatory initiatives that are happening around the world, Finland, Estonia, Dubai, Singapore, and England and Scotland separately, and actually start to think, can we improve the IFC, improve the content in the BSDD, to make sure that many of the use cases around regulatory processes are covered. And essentially, it came down to identifying what types of things people are regulating, and does the current IFC represent those well enough? And do we need to extend the list of predefined types that are supported and those kind of things? And also, what further properties do we need to think about? And the summary is that we've identified about 200 properties that we would like to see made available on the BSDD and hopefully incorporated into the next full release of IFC as being strong, very core building smart content. In the meantime, we want to use the use case management tool to put out information about the processes that we're trying to support. And the use case management tool essentially contains information delivery manuals, descriptions, and we want to publish our results to the BSDD. And now that we have, so it says IDM, it should say IDS. We have IDS as a way of encouraging the use of the properties that we're recommending. And I think it's inevitably we've had to focus on three main areas: fire, accessibility, and energy, as the three things that many or most, maybe even all regulatory systems look at. So again, we're coming to some conclusions. In our discussions yesterday, we picked up some points that we need to check and to finalize, and we really want help with reviewing that. Sorry, yes, that's the slide that summarizes the three use cases. We didn't try and cover mechanical resistance and stability, which is usually driven by structural codes, and we just didn't have the expertise, let alone the contacts to consider that. Of course, there are also questions about architectural quality, and I'm not sure we want automated compliance to be looking at architectural quality. And also there's the planning regulations, which we kind of cover by implication, but it wasn't really the main focus of our topic. Our work in progress tool has been a spreadsheet. At one time, it contained 3,000 entries, and we've been filtering it down. And the important thing is we're not just rejecting stuff. We're looking at things and saying, is it relevant internationally, or is it just a local issue, local topic? Or is the information already in the IFC, or can be calculated from the things that are already recommended to be in the IFC information? And we also had to pick out the things that the regulations or the requirements that referred to other clauses or other documents or diagrams or whatever, to say that's all very local. And what we're left with, as I say, is about 200 properties, which we will now check and make sure the descriptions are clear, and then we'll be working to get those loaded into the BSDD and to make an IDS so that people can test the suggestions in practice. This morning, not in the regulatory room, but in the sustainability strategic group, we presented the work that has been done under that umbrella. The sustainability strategic group was set up to draw expertise from all the other domains, particularly the building domain and the regulatory domain. But we've had input from the product domain. And I know we're being watched closely by the infrastructure and rail sectors. So the reason it was a strategic group was to try and make sure that we could avoid any barriers and silos in the buildingSMART organization itself. So we looked at this process of analyzing sustainability, and as you probably should for any buildingSMART project, we started with a process diagram. We identified that the creation of the facility, whether it's infrastructure, building, or plant, is usually under the control of an architect or an engineer. If it's an existing facility, it may be a surveyor, but they will produce a description of the facility, and that's labeled A. And then either they or another actor, which we might call the specifier or the procurer, will specify the products, materials, and types. And so we've labeled that activity B. And then then the next step is to associate that information to the declarations, the environmental profiles, the detailed information, depending on what aspects of sustainability we're trying to assess. And again, that might be the specifier or, who does that, or it may be a third swim lane with an assessor or an expert doing that, and that's labeled C. The result of those 3 steps is to then provide the information into the bottom swim lane, which is marked the assessment scheme. And that will take the information about the facility, measure the quantities, scale it according to the product data, and then scale it according to the declarations to get the total impacts. Now, the scope of the sustainability information requirements is not to specify that process. There are European standards for doing this. The UK has recently published a standard for doing this, and I know there are similar standards in the US and Canada. So what we wanted to do was to look at the step A and the step B and the step C and say, what information are we talking about here? And by examining those 3 things separately, we've been able to generate 3 separate IDSs, which are applicable to any time during the project life cycle, any time during the asset life cycle. And each IDS can be represented as an annex. It can be attached to a contract to say what information should be present. You're seeing there the first clause, which says that on a facility model, it must have a latitude and longitude described. 1, because we want to know what jurisdiction it's in. 2, we'll be using that to estimate transport journeys and so on. And then the paragraph marked A then goes on to say there are a few pieces of extra information that you must have on the facility, including, for example, the year of construction, because that is a major determinant of what product data may be relevant to follow up with. So IDS can be presented as a document, as a PDF that can be attached to contracts and execution plans and so on. But of course, its most important role is to test the delivery of information, that everything is being provided. So we're in the process of finalizing that. This morning we discussed some of the remaining topics, and it was very good to get the feedback from the audience and to find out where the last few decisions should go, we need to make. And we presented an example based on an extension I'm having built on my house right now. Well, I hope it's very soon anyway. And we were able to show that by dividing the information requirements up into information about the facility and what it's made of, information about the products, and then information in declarations, you can then bring those together. And in this very, very simple example, I can estimate that my new upper floor extension has probably got a global warming potential of 6,350 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, I'll say it again, the sustainability information requirements is not about any particular method, but it is about saying what information do we need to bring together to do these kind of examples, these kind of calculations, usually under the control of a standard or a scheme, which will affect how you do the calculations in detail. The other session this morning, I was invited to join the building domain as if I were a building regulator myself. And so we wrote, in this live demonstration, we wrote some regulations that might be applicable to a house being built in Valencia. It's all fictitious, please don't take it too seriously. And so we wrote 3 clauses. And in order to translate requirements, regulatory requirements like this, we used a method of marking up the document using 4 colors. And that then allows it to be machine readable. So we were then able to systematically check the designs coming from the architect. And I'm pleased to say that the first version from the architect had about 50 errors and issues in it. By the time we did the demonstration this morning, it was down to about 6. One of the requirements was a very simple requirement that every object should have a unique name. Now, normally, designers don't do that. They might give unique names to spaces, but we went further and said that everything that might fail a regulation must have a unique name so that on the notification of failure, we can name it and it refers specifically to an object. We also use BCF to send the information back to the architects to say, please fix the following things. And in the end, the only substantive issue was that there were 2 doors that were not wide enough for wheelchair access. And so during the session, I gave permission for the building on condition that those 2 issues were resolved. So we have, in the course of the summit so far, the regulatory agenda, whether it's sustainability or direct checking, or getting the industry ready with the regulatory information requirements and the guidance, we've been trying to make sure that the buildingSMART standards can play an active role in what's required. As I said at the beginning, we always imagined that the introduction of automated code compliance would be done in small steps. And we've shown this diagram and diagrams like it many times. I have to say that we've been proved wrong, that some countries, pardon me, some countries have gone, including Dubai and Estonia, are going straight to full automation without going through any early stages. And that's exciting, but I think it's important to also think about what the intermediate stages could be. It could be checklists that are generated automatically that help with the paper-based process at the moment. It could be regulatory documents that reduce in size as you get more specific about the project that you're currently working on. It could be the generation of just report templates so that the regulatory teams can see the information they need to carry out their usual manual processes. So I think I can be very excited that we are now seeing automatic code compliance checking. I think we can also continue to think about what the halfway house steps are. This is a diagram about the way change happens. And yes, we thought we were going to be on a path 3, which is some stepwise changes towards the ultimate, or the ultimate goal of automatic code compliance. In some countries, they have they're taking route 2, which is after going straight to full compliance as quickly as possible. And I think perhaps you could say that a country like Finland has been thinking hard about the use of IFC for 20 years. They've always been in the forefront of the development of IFC, and they've always had a lot of very good standards and guidance for people using IFC and BIM. And so it's a lot easier for them to say that on the 1st of January next year, IFC will be compulsory because they've had a 20-year run-up. This is a diagram which summarizes the building compliance processes. And this is the diagram that reflects most countries' processes, that we have building regulations, and we have potentially a building information model, and we will use automated code compliance to assess the two together. And if we generate a fail, as we did with the building project this morning, the red arrow will take you around to virtual rework to improve the building information model. If we get a pass, we will proceed to building on site, and there will continue to be checking, maybe by the city authorities, maybe by insurers or other inspectors. And of course, if you generate a failure during the construction phase, then the path for failure is actually to demand rework on site. So you hope that the potential errors will be found in the virtual phase and not in the real phase, and so on. The reason for putting that up there is to compare it with infrastructure. Infrastructure projects can be a lot bigger than building projects. They can be under the control of government bodies, and particularly given the size of their budgets, they tend to be developed by organizations that both set the engineering regulations that they want to follow, and then they develop the engineering designs for infrastructure projects. And so something quite interesting happens if you have automated compliance checking in that environment. And I'm thinking of big road projects, big rail projects, maybe power and utility installations. The result of a failure or a mismatch in automatic compliance doesn't necessarily mean that the engineering, the design will change. There's another path where organizations will claim exceptions for themselves. In English, they're sometimes called departures or derogations. Let's just call them exceptions because, and they will effectively add a new rule that says, actually, you can do what you want to do. We're not going to enforce the rules as they were. We're going to record this exception. And that exception then becomes part of the engineering regulations that they're following. And that then means that the regulations are much more fluid and more dynamic than they are in the building sector. And when we're thinking about automated code compliance, we've got to think about how we manage the addition of extra cases which are allowable. And in some ways, it's like English and American law, which is that every case that is decided in English law can be referred to by future cases as being an example that no doubt means that they should be allowed to do whatever happens. So we have this process of exceptions. Of course, once things are on site, the penalty for not matching the engineering model is still that you may have to have rework. I suppose you could even argue that in that stage, you might go back and say, well, we're already committed to this, we want an exception, and so on. So compliance checking in infrastructure, I think, is potentially more complex and much more dynamic. The reason for mentioning it is that each of the domains has to draw up a roadmap. And in fact, I think we were the second domain to have our roadmap ready. And on it, we have been plotting in the yellow band the engagement that we follow. And some of you will have seen the survey we did. Franco has helped us with developing a strategy from that. We've also had an engagement process of holding online webinars twice a year. So we have this rolling program of engagement with the idea that the end point is that we want to get governments and users of the regulatory system to be aware of the potential of what we're offering. Obviously, we're following the developments of technology, the standards, the ISO standards, and the buildingSMART standards. And the goal to which we're working is a complete set of standards supporting automated regulatory processes. In the pink band, we're looking at implementation, and we keep a very close watching eye on all the implementations around the world we can. Sometimes the world takes us by surprise. Literally, someone walked into an office I was working in London and said, I want to tell you about what's happening in Malaysia. And we had no idea that they had an automated code compliance program underway. So sometimes our watching isn't successful, but anyway, we've now fully briefed on the Malaysian program. And of course, we evaluate what we're doing, and we're trying to make it sustainable so that the tools we deliver continue to support the industry. As well as a roadmap, we also have a work schedule. And actually, we're sticking quite well to it. On this diagram, 2024, we are completing the work items like developing the regulatory information requirements and delivering the guidance for government. Some of the things we put on our roadmap have moved sideways. So our intention to look at environmental assessment and CO2 calculations was taken by the sustainability group, which is good. And we're still having conversations about working with the rail room and the infrastructure room to see how well our reports and our ideas measure up to their needs. That leaves a question, which is, what else should we be doing? Assuming we get the two projects, the guidance for regulators and the regulatory information requirements completed in the next couple of months, by the time we meet again in Morocco, we should probably have an idea of what we need to do next. And this is why I might even turn the microphone off in a moment and start asking you what you think we should do next. As ever, the big question that we're asking is, are we doing the right things? Can you help us do the right things? Can we help you do the right things? Our email address is regulatory@buildingsmart.org, and that's one thing. But today, I'd really like to hear if there are any suggestions about what the regulatory room could do more to help you, help the community, improve the regulatory and requirements side of the business. So, we have a microphone here. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments?
Okay, David Fung from Hong Kong. Being an architect myself, I get involved in this regulatory processes, but most of the time we're talking about the design phase to get it approved, and usually we are talking about buildings here. But even with the buildings, but there are two more steps before the building is the master planning phases. So that's also one part of the regulatory. Now we do have topics like BIM plus GIS as a technology aspect, but still there's a regulatory aspect from that technology. So that's one side of it. On the other hand, once the building is completed, there's also the material approval. It varies from countries, maybe, but so the architect need to certify the material being constructed is in accordance to the fire code or whatever. So that's also another area apart from the design of regulatory approval. By the same token, we do have like the product stream, product domain, and also PSCT. Now, again, they're looking from a more technical perspective, but again, it also need to bring back to the regulatory aspect as well. So I can see that. I mean, for this regulatory domain, we can actually extend to a bigger scale and smaller scale, and incorporate the technical aspects as well. So yeah, this is one of my observations.
That's a good point. We haven't addressed master planning zoning concept approval is the term that we've used because it gets called so many different things around the world. And I think and you're right, the key to it is using information from BIM and information from GIS to achieve the same results. And I think part of that is not assuming that all the information needed will be in BIM. It may be in the master plan, which may be represented a zoning plan in a GIS, or of course the information may be in product data, or it could be information that is in the application form, and so on. And so I think whilst we know that the bulk of the information is going to be in the BIM, we have to make room for considering other sources of information. Increasingly, countries are using, during construction, people are inspecting the site, and the process has a lot to do with comparing what's actually happening on site with what's in the BIM. If you claim the corridor was going to be 1 meter wide, checking that it really is 1 meter wide. Of course, if there's a discrepancy, you might then go back to the regulations and say, okay, it's 950. Is that allowed in the regulations? But most of the checking process on site is about checking that the actual matches what you said you were going to do in directly. We're also seeing more and more, particularly around fire, we're seeing more and more regulation about buildings in use. And I think that's something that could be looked at. It may be every 5 years that you have to get the building, a public building, recertified, and so on. And that's a process which it should be supported by what in the UK we call the golden thread, but a history of the building to prove that nothing has happened to make things worse. And so on. So that's a good area too. So that's some good points. Any other thought? Yep.
Yeah, coming back maybe to the fire regulation. In Belgium, we also did some experiments. We have some projects around that. And a few slides back, you had an example of some race-like approach, I think, to having some natural language to machine readable. But those examples seemed very simple. A door has to have the minimum width of this. I feel when I look at the fire regulation in Belgium, but I think in Europe in general, it is quite complex to make it in simple sentences like that. Do you have any experience with that, or do you have the same feeling? Or?
The reasons the sentences were simple was that I wrote them very quickly. I actually think that Raise can help with sentences of unlimited complexity. That's its strength, because and the complexity of regulatory sentences varies across the world. This is one thing I know. The Americans have the most complex regulations. Their paragraphs and sentences are written by committees of 1,000 or 2,000 people in a room. And so people are constantly adding on extra clauses and sub-clauses and exceptions and so on. The UK regulations have spectacularly long sentences in them as well. I suspect, and I don't speak Chinese and I wish I did, that the Chinese regulations tend to be the kind of short sentences that you saw. And that's an interesting point. The other thing about fire regulations in particular is that they introduce concepts that may not be represented in the BIM model. Compartmentation, escape route. In fact, escape routes are probably need to be the subject of a study in their own right. In some countries, it's the regulator who looks for escape routes, and measures them and decides. In some countries, the designer proposes the escape routes, and the regulator signs them off, and so on. So, yeah. So there are these extra concepts that you have to think about how they're going to be represented in terms, because they may not have been. And a compartment, a fire compartment in a building, it's both a collection of spaces and the walls and slabs that are on the edges of that compartment. So sometimes you have to be very careful with which you're talking about. But I think the capturing of the regulations can be done. When we did a technical study of rule languages, which is the idea of between the written regulation and testing it on BIM, do you need to have something in the middle? We looked at a lot of specialist rule languages, BIM-RL, and also generic rule languages from computer science and so on. And actually, we found in the examples we looked at that RAISE was perfectly good at capturing the examples we got. We took one regulation about escape routes, and we got people all over the world to automate that same rule in different toolkits and so on. So I think we can do it. And of course, the reasons for doing it, using RAISE, might be that writing computer software is still slow and expensive and often inaccurate. One of the things that we wrote about in that report was a Korean building regulation and its interpretation into a kind of Visual Basic, I think it was. And you could identify 30 concepts in the document, and 15 of them were misrepresented in the code that someone had written. Now, at the time, the person who did this was an undergraduate at the Korean university. He's now a professor, so I should probably stop talking about his mistakes in his youth. But yeah, so one of the reasons for using RAISE is that it cuts out the idea of a programming language, or almost completely. And if it's not marked up correctly, then it won't be correctly implemented, but any regulator can do the markup. So we have this, I have this vision that there is a better way than training programmers. And so for any programmers in the room, I apologize, but I'm frankly bullish. So yeah, I think RAISE is a very good gateway into making sure that the regulators are involved in automated code compliance. They're not just giving them a solution and saying, trust us, we've programmed it correctly. They can see that you've done that. I should say, RAISE is my invention, my methodology. It's not the policies that we started yet. So, any other thoughts on what we should be doing?
Either from Hong Kong. The question I'd like to raise is, how long will it take
To automate a page, I think. Well, rough estimate. This is not contractually binding, but I've heard other people saying it takes a week of programming to capture a page of regulations. We can capture a page of regulations in an hour. So you can do that and then go home early.
My English is not so good, but one question I have about classification of requirements. We know that geometrical parameters we can easily to check in model, but for example, analytical, some tasks or another properties we not can check easily. Do you have any classification about this requirement?
Well, I think a lot of work and a lot of worries like that come from the fact that people assume the answer has to be in the BIM. When you start adding in GIS and other information sources, a lot of things that look difficult become easy or easy. In the UK, we did a project called DCOM, Digital Compliance, and when it came to the energy regulations, the answer is not in the BIM. What we had to do was to invoke automatically an energy analysis package and wait for the answer to come back, and then we knew what the predicted energy was and we could continue with the regulations. And people cleverer than me got the computers to synchronize nicely, and wait for the results and then continue. So there will always be some analysis, could be structural analysis, could be energy analysis, where you have to delegate it to something. The other area where people say, oh, we can't automate that, is where the regulations are, they appear soft. The wash-hand basin must be near the toilet, and no one knows what the word near means. And if you're trying to say that the answer must be found in a BIM model, you will never find it. But if you say, well, that's what the regulation says, where does the answer to that question come from? You can say, well, actually, it doesn't come from the architect. It must come from the inspector. It's his opinion as to whether nearly is okay, and so on. So you have to build into your process a thing that says, stops and says, in the opinion of the inspector, is it near enough? Now, architects and designers hate that for two reasons. One, it slows down their process because they have to wait for an answer, and it puts power out of their hands into the hands of someone else. So yes, there are regulations which are not directly computable using BIM, but a process that says we understand the whole regulation, and unless there's any other way of getting through this regulation, we will have to stop and wait for this answer. That's what the regulation says, that's what you have to do. So the way to look at all these different clauses is to say, where would the information to answer this question come from? And then a lot of the things that people have said can't be done. Some people say 75% of the regulations can't be done. Some say 25% can't be done. They're asking the wrong question because they're just saying, can BIM on its own answer the question? And that's not actually the right question at all. So I'm a 100% kind of guy. If necessary, we'll farm things out. For the very simple examples for the building demonstration, there were two requirements there that required calculation. One about door widths and one about the window to floor ratios in the rooms. Now, yes, you have to write down the equation. And then something like wheelchair access becomes calculable, as long as someone can write down the necessary equation. And so it doesn't have to be, the information doesn't have to be explicit in the BIM, what is the clear opening of this door, it can be, I have the structural width and the width of the frame, therefore I know what the clear width is. So again, currently many regulations look at the total number of this or the total number of that. The BIM won't contain that information. It will contain the things that you have to go and count to get that answer, and so on. So one of the processes we had to go through was to look for the things that could be deduced from information that will be in the BIM, and so on. So yeah, I think this process of thinking carefully is another reason why you want to get regulators to do the markup, so that it's their knowledge that you're capturing.
If I get right, we need a responsible matrix for each stakeholders, and each stakeholder must have some specification questions for checking, and which checking needs status. This checking can check in model, this checking analytical.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I call it a dictionary, which might not be the right word. But when we were doing decom, there was a dictionary that said if the checking process comes across a question about the energy performance, then contact this server over there that is running an energy simulator and wait for the answer to come back. Sometimes it went to the dictionary and it said, go and ask the BIM directly. Sometimes it said, here's a formula. Now go and look for the information that's needed for that formula, and so on. So yes, it does a signposting job. But the important thing is that can also be an explicit document that people can review and check. It's not a black box. So again, you can get the regulators to see what you are asking the machine to do. And if it says energy consumption and it says go and ask such and such a program, the regulator might say, no, that program's not on the acceptable list. You find another service or whatever. So everything can be reviewed. Nothing is hidden in the code. So it's quite important. Okay, sorry. It's yeah.
Yeah, sorry for another question.
Yeah.
I feel that maybe natural language is not the best way to express requirements or regulations. I tried it also to bring with ChatGPT some fire safety text to race, and also to IDS. It was not a huge success. But my question is, wouldn't it be better if the regulators, instead of writing natural language, use something else instead, something that is ready-made, computer readable, or I mean, this is a little bit philosophical, maybe, but
yeah.
Is that not a problem? Instead of us trying to constantly get those texts into reading machine readable formats?
But they still have to be read by human beings as well. And
Or a second version of it, like a parallel version next to it?
no lawyer will ever allow two versions of the same document. Not at a government level, not at a guidance level. Or very few will. So yes, we can all, as designers, we can all wish, wouldn't it be nice if the regulators wrote in IFC or wrote in such and such a language, because then it would be close to what we want to do. I also hear regulators saying, why can't designers give us the information we need in the way that we need it? And I think if you wait for all the regulations, building regulations around the world to be rewritten, you have a long wait. It's not going to happen. And yeah, one of the reasons is that they will not allow two versions of the same thing. Yeah.
Thank you. And how can you solve the ambiguity and the vagueness in the regulations?
Sorry, just come again?
The ambiguity and the
Ambiguity. Well,
in the regulations.
I have a colleague at the university who has just written a PhD on ambiguity in regulations. So there is a long answer. I think what she wrote about was that there are several kinds of ambiguity. Sometimes drafting is poor, and an outsider finds it difficult to understand. If I say external doors and windows, people will worry about whether the external word applies to the doors or both the doors and the windows, and that's poor drafting. The other kinds of ambiguity often depend on knowledge that the regulators have but isn't in the document. So as a computer person, I can look at a document and think, that makes no sense. In the UK, there are regulations about the contrast between the color of doors and the color of floors to help people who are partially sighted to navigate through a building. And so it says that the color of the door must contrast with the color of the floor. It's very easy to look at that and say, oh, that's impossible. What are we meant to do? What does contrast mean? The answer is that everyone in the industry knows that there is a British standard that says this is how you calculate whether two colors contrast or not. And so outsiders can look at a sentence and say that's ambiguous. But insiders have knowledge which they deploy in answering these questions. So there are a few more categories of ambiguity. But buildings do get checked and approved. So there must be a way that people are answering these questions. So the fact that it looks difficult to outsiders just means we have to ask the right people the right questions, or they need to do the markup so that we get the right approach. And once you know that there's a British standard on contrasting colors, it all becomes very simple and straightforward.
Thanks, Nick. And I missed the first part, and I'm sorry. So you might have covered this. So I have a three-part question. Comes back to yesterday's question with Tommy around rules, and rule definition, and that there's work around ontology development of rule definition, and should we not be basing, driving our models or how we want to do this based on those rule sets, instead of getting it pulling on the model instead of pushing, property sets and stuff like that. It's a bit of a circular argument. The second question is, yes, it'd be nice to have machine readable, and you're involved with our project within RC, but building codes are historically, massive amounts of pages and everything. And we talked about programming. Is there a way around sort of the digitizing the codes? What are the best processes? And the third question is I'm missing. I'll let you start with those first two, and it'll come back to me the third
Okay.
question.
Yeah, I think part of the analysis we did in the regulatory information requirements was to say, does this need to be a property, or can it be discovered from information that's naturally in the BIM or could be in the BIM already? At lunchtime, we were having an argument about the volume of a building. Hang on, the volume of a building for regulatory purposes is the sum of the volumes of all the spaces. So do you need that as a separate attribute? So yes, we need to be careful not to over-demand information in the BIM. And some of it, as sort of discussed, may be in other data sources. So I think it's an important part of the process is to say, where is that information, and how, and how are we going to get it? As far as the complexity and volume of regulations, it varies from country to country. And what we don't want to get into a situation is where we tell a country, sorry, we can't do your regulations because the sentences are too long. Or we can't do your regulations because you use subjunctive clauses. I don't know what a subjunctive clause is, but it could be features of grammar and sentences that are difficult. So we don't want to get into a trap of saying that we have a solution or an approach that doesn't work in places. In UK, the building codes date back to 1600, and some of them were only repealed a few years ago, and so on. So there's a history which you can't change about how the regulations got written, and so on. Yeah.
The third one came back, and so there's a big push towards performance-based codes now. They're seen as more as allowing innovation, and so we're getting away from these prescriptive codes. They're going to exist for a long time. We're going to have parallel tracks. We're going to have compliance mechanisms that are showing, compliance pathways that are suitable for performance-based codes. How do we, transition to that?
Well, I think the most designers, most contractors want a simple life. And so if there is a direct way of satisfying a regulation, they will use the simple way. Of course, if they have a particular problem, something like a theatre, and it may not be possible to pass the prescriptive regulation. And you might want to say, in that case, we will call the service that does an escape analysis on a theatre based on, hopefully based on good research on how people behave in fires or whatever, and so on. And so actually it becomes easier for people to say, well, maybe we'll try the performance-based route if the regulations allow it, and so on. So I think it's not as big a difference. It's not an absolute difference between performance and prescriptive, and many regulations allow a bit of both. So maybe you try, the clause says either you do this or you do that, and you try this. One of the insights that I've had is that there are lots of ways of passing a regulation. If I passed a law that said all paper cups should be brown, then you can tell that this passes. You might not be sure whether it's a cup or not, but it's definitely brown. So the easiest way of passing a regulation is to pass the exact, up there it's in dark blue, requirement. Or I could say, well, actually that regulation only applies to paper cups. And if I was able to argue that it's actually polystyrene, then I might be able to argue past it by saying, well, it's not a paper cup. Or you could have exceptions that say all paper cups should be brown, unless they are being used, I don't know, in a state function or something. And you might be able to say, actually, it's a state function. We're claiming an exception. So there are 4 different ways of passing a regulation. And one of the things that's really important is when either translating regulations into computer code or using markup, is that you don't neglect these alternative routes. When people were marking up this Korean regulation as an example, there was a clause that said that if it was an automated factory, you didn't have to have an escape route. But the actual clause said, if it's an automated factory and you have permission from the Ministry of Construction, then you don't have to have an escape route. Everyone ignored the bit about a letter from the Minister for Construction. Because they were all thinking BIM and saying, well, we don't store letters from the ministry inside BIM. But actually, it was as valid a way as passing the regulation as all the other things. So, yeah, we have to make sure that we don't put on the wrong glasses and only see the numeric calculation. We also respect the bits of regulations that say, talk about process or exceptions or allowances or whatever.
Because that's where performance-based codes are going. It's just, it's not about numerical values. It's going to be, you have to demonstrate that it is suitable for a purpose. And I think
yeah, and some of them say, if you can demonstrate that the performance of people escaping from a theatre is as good as the performance of a building that's done prescriptively, then you may carry on and so on. So that's why I say it's a spectrum. Yeah, so there are options there. Now, of course, we know that doing an analysis, a performance analysis, is going to take minutes or hours or days. And so we may often look for the more direct route to see if we pass that first. And code checking can do the same thing and prioritize the easy checks so that we only end up doing energy modeling when we have to.
One thing we're also looking at, or at least from the Canadians, is structural code, seismic codes, and looking at mass timber and sort of innovative structural products and structural behavior. And that's a whole other set of modeling rules and performance specifications. So which I don't know if we're touching in this
I'm not a structural engineer, so I'm not going to claim that I can answer those questions. But it seems to me that even structural codes are a set of rules, and that they often introduce definitions and new intermediate terms like load factors and all. But actually, it is a set of rules. And in fact, the first automatic code compliance application was done by a structural engineer in the 1960s, where he wrote out tables of decisions that you made when designing, I think, steel beams. So it can be done.
Structural. I think that's the first one that's really gotten automated, but now they're actually trying to move towards structural performance, and it's going to be interesting because historically structures have been their calculations. It's basically a set of numbers that are calculated.
Yeah.
But then what do you have to achieve? And it's based on region, like the West Coast is more prone to earthquakes and stuff like that. Then it becomes, I think, a lot of interesting scenarios that have to be, and if you don't want to, same thing, if, for instance, we're trying to promote the use of aluminum and mass timber in construction. And how do you, what are the equivalencies that you can achieve? You can achieve structural health like that, structural behaviors, but you sort of, how do you demonstrate that, and how do you actually get that through the regulatory bodies?
One of the demonstrations I was involved with, the system, rules-based system, generated, if you failed, it generated recommended actions. And so in the particular example, it said you should improve, or you could improve the U value, the thermal value of this window. But it said, or you could get the space behind it reclassified from being habitable to being not a habitable space. Or you could get the building reclassified from being an office space to being a warehouse. Or you could move the building to a different state. Now, I was embarrassed, of course, because the machine generated these results and they were up on the big screen. But luckily, there was a guy there from a big supermarket chain, and he said, that's spot on. If we can't build the building we want to build in Seattle, then we will move to the next state along where we can. And so, yeah, one of the surprising things about automating systems is that it can force you to think laterally, because the machine doesn't know that the obvious thing to do of improving the U value is, 99 times out of 100, that's what you're going to do. It just says these are the factors that led to you failing, and you need to decide which one you want to adjust. And similarly with a pass, if you get a pass, it can come back and say, you passed because of these things, so don't mess with them, and so on. So yeah. And if on site you have a variation, then maybe that variation is attached to an object that's been marked as being safety critical, and you recheck it to see whether accepting product X instead of product Y keeps you in a compliant state. So I think you can drive this lots of different ways, and so on. Coming back to what the regulatory room should do next, because I will continue developing these ideas. We've had the suggestion of looking at master planning and at construction sign-off or material sign-off and so on, and see if there's anything we need to think about further. And we've had the suggestion of involving the Belgium-led fire BIM project. The other thing I wondered if it would come up is health and safety, which is a regulatory topic in most countries now. And many health and safety government agencies are expecting designers to consider safety early and so on. Can I just ask, as far as you're aware, does your country review and examine health and safety during the design stage? Any yeses, any nos?
Meaning construction health and safety, or?
Particularly, particularly construction health and safety.
It's not a regulatory.
No.
There's a building board in Canada. It's a regulatory board that does do on-site health and safety, but it's not health and safety plans and everything are done on a project basis, following some requirements.
Yeah. Okay. So, mm-hmm.
For designers, require specific project.
Yeah. Okay.
In Spain is required.
Good. I mean, certainly in the UK, the legislation spreads. There are duties on the main contractor, of course, but there are also duties on the design team to consider things and share information and so on. So I'm currently working on ISO 19650 Part 6, which is about encouraging the sharing of risk information. But I wondered if it might be a topic for this regulatory domain. Okay. Any other points people want to make? I think, yes, we're wrapping up at 3, aren't we? Yes. So any other comments before we close? I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we'll be discussing in the regulatory domain steering committee the suggestions and what we do next. Yep.
When I look at the term regulatory information requirement, which did not exist in the ISO terminology there, does it mean that they will have a corresponding BSDD or IDS definitions?
We will generate all the material in all the forms that it might be needed.
Yeah. Would that be a direction, right?
Yeah. So that's ready for publication. Yeah.
Okay, just not about today, because I need to read more to make smart questions, but you are sending this document to the people that have asked for it.
Yes.
And what is the time you expect to get back comments, if there are?
We will draft the letter on Monday, the email. I would suggest within a month, because we want to get it out there. Yeah, we want to finish.
No, yeah, I understand. No, but I just wanted to have an idea of time, because when one acquires a compromise, you need to know what you are compromising to.
Yeah, I'm guessing that when we discuss it, that will be the answer. But yeah, good.
It will be published also on the public website?
When it is finished, it will become an official buildingSMART publication, along with the other regulatory reports you can download, and the material will be in the BSDD and the IDS. There isn't an IDS download page yet, so we'll have to think how we do that. It might be through the use case management tool. That would be the right thing to do. Okay. Well, thank you very much.